she'd been on it for that long anyway. And has been described as a woman who's had more effect on people's attitude to food than probably many other people. And Sheila has been, as it were, standing by since 2020, when we were supposed to be having this debate before COVID struck. So thank you very much, Sheila, for continuing to stand by for us and for being here now today. This is in order speaking as well. Next will be Scythe Fairlie, who many of you know, our own scything champion, who basically more or less reintroduced scything into this country almost single-handedly over the last 20 years, and was the founder of the Scythe part of the Green Scythe there. Has a micro dairy at Monkton Wild in Dorset, and has also written a number of books. Most recently, his autobiography, which I'm looking forward to read. I haven't got round to it yet. But more particularly for this afternoon, was the author of Meat a Benign Extravagance? ? And Douglas will be exploring that through the debate. And then finally, Dr. Alice. And finally, Dr. Alice Brough, who used to be a pig industry vet and was horrified by the sort of conditions that she was having to prop up with her veterinary practice, and therefore went completely native and converted to being a vegan, and is no longer a vet, but is a food activist. So it's really great that Alice has come to join us here, and she has. There is a book which she has written with Tim, who's over there, who may participate later on in the discussion time, and which will be available for sale as well, probably in the Green Info Cafe after the debate. So anyway. Ladies, Poor Alice was late because she still copied all over herself as she was leaving, and now it looks like Simon's done the same thing with fear. So it was obviously catching. Right. So without more ado, I'm not going to say any more apart from the fact that, well, we know what a temperature this subject sometimes produces, and whilst we can enjoy the heat, we certainly don't want any of the vitriol that sometimes comes with it. But I'm sure you, as an audience, who are intelligent enough to come to the Green Scythe there, are not going to indulge in any of that rubbish. So, without more ado, I want to introduce Sheila to take us 15 minutes each they have, and then we might have some discussion and so on from the floor after that. Thank you. Sheila.
Thank you very much. Francis Hervey is very good. I'm going to sit down because I have foolishly just got what I... I don't know. Okay. Because I've got an up. So that we can see what effect this debate has. Could you, people who think veganism cannot save the world, would you mind raising your hands? Well, a significant minority, anyway. Okay. The first thing I'd like to say is that I absolutely believe that we have to eat a lot less meat, and the meat we eat has to be a lot better. But no one thing can save the world. I think it's the kind of thinking that got us into this mess in the first place. The simple answer is never the right answer, or very rarely. Life is complex, nature is complex, and we have to think inside those complexities, not make ourselves feel better with slogans. Veganism often seems to me, for many people, a substitute for religion. It's not a religion. And that kind of sloganeering, I think, is Trumpism. So veganism, I think, cannot save the world, but there are ways that it can help. 10 days ago, I was at a fairly new dairy farm in West Dorset, set up by a banker, a lot of money. Really, I mean, a very, very impressive dairy farm producing high quality milk, cheese, butter, cream. And I was surprised to hear one of the people in the management team say how wonderful veganism was for them, because veganism told them that they were on the right track in producing high quality food, because it said we finally in this country have a generation who are concerned about food, who care about food. And I think that's one of the most interesting things that veganism is saying. It's saying we care about food. Let's think about food. But to get to the issue, the big argument for veganism, that I can see, is that animals produce methane, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. Yes, it is, though it has a much shorter life than carbon. Methane comes from a number of sources, and sometimes, if you read The Guardian, you'd think that it all came from belching cows. According to the International Energy Agency, IEA, leaks from oil and gas wells produce about a third of global emissions of methane. Landfill sites, according to Project Drawdown, produce about 12%. Rice paddies, again, maybe around 12%, but those figures are certainly, they're contested and they're not very well counted. And then some other crops, a lot of crops emit a little. But the rest is supposed to be belched out by livestock, particularly dairy and beef cattle. Now that's particularly... This is not like to be my it's my fault, sorry. Particularly in pathos, as they're called in the United States, concentrated animal feeding operations, of which there are thousands in the United States and thousands in China, and they are growing. The biggest issue there is not necessarily the methane being belched out by the animals. It's the breakdown of the manure, because it's not manure the way you might think of it in Somerset, or the way Simon would think of it and use it. It's not composted with straw, it's slurry. And it goes into these vast lagoons. And, because that's what happens when you're torturing animals on a huge scale. You get masses of manure. And, the American government says that it's up to 20 times the manure produced by those animals in campers that is produced by the entire human population of the United States. Anyway, methane GURPS from these lagoons. There are some experiments, and there are a few of these farms where they use the methane, but the majority do not. And I suppose what aggravates me as a journalist is that when these figures get bandied about the horrors of animal farming and the effect on the environment, the figures that are being used are these global figures, which are based on the United States, mostly, China and Asia to a lesser degree. And we in Britain are being pushed in that direction. And I'll get into why I think that's happening. We certainly have dairy, pig, and chicken farms that no one can be proud of, as Alice will tell you. But the essential thing to me is that we change those models. But if you've been reading this weekend's papers, you will know that the government white paper, which is out tomorrow, leaked yesterday, shows how very little interest this government, like a whole slew of governments before it, Labour and Conservative, have in doing anything serious about our food supply. And this white paper is based on Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, which was in pretty radical attempt to redraw how we farm, produce, buy our food. Well, that's all happened the way it's in Bulgaria. So the question is, why is it so hard to change industrial models of food production? Well, it doesn't require a genius to come up with the answer to that, but it's because it's cheap at the till. And I don't know if any of you heard, what's his name? The Cumbrian sheep farmer. During Rebanks at Christmas, he edited one edition of the Today program on Radio 4, and as part of that, he was interviewed, and the Today presenter said to him, "Well, James, you seem to be arguing that food should be more expensive, but that's terrible because we need cheap food to feed the poor." And Rebank said, "You don't solve poverty by messing around with the price of food. You do that by redistributing income. And what you have just said is propaganda." And it's propaganda that, I don't know, a frighteningly large percentage of people in the United Kingdom seem to believe. So we have, it's cheap, is what Rebanks was saying, because we have cheap food, because the costs are borne by taxpayers and by nature. We have an agricultural system in this country based in great part, sadly, upon the United States, that's shaped around high yields and high returns for investors. Because there was a point of Second World War II when agriculture transmogrified into an industry that attracted serious money. And it is now, agribusiness is one of the most seriously profitable global sectors. It's more profitable than some elements of technology and in fact, oil and gas. So we have this agricultural food system around high yields, high returns, and that depends on subsidies. I mean, look at the United States to see what subsidized corn has created. We have become, or the Americans have become, corn animals. It's in almost every processed food that you buy in the States. We've got a tax system that rewards investment in technology, in drugs, and in buildings. It does not reward you in investing in labor. We have public research programs shaped to the needs of agribusiness. I mean, look, for one example, look at our grain research in the UK. 99% is about yield, ease of harvest, disease resistance, and resistance to herbicides. How much research money goes into organics? Almost nothing. And on top of that, you've got an unthinking public that has bought the notion of cheapness and choice, the madness of choice, as the main values in food. So, I realize I've just gone slightly, yes. It's also, as Michael Pollan, the American writer, pointed out, it's food that's so cheap at the till that it enables companies to pay low wages. I know we don't usually think of it like that, but it is like that. If you can get food really cheaply, you can pay people a lot less. And I often think about how that works in the United Kingdom. I mean, we know that wages in agriculture, food factories, supermarkets are some of the lowest in the country. And a high percentage of people with those jobs, working in those areas, need state benefits. Who pays the state benefits? We do. But, as Tesco says, every little bit helps. I mean, I'd love to know the percentage of Tesco employees who are on state benefits. The advantages of veganism. As I said in my story about the Dorset farm, it's a sign that people are engaging with food, which has been a rare phenomenon in this country. And because we have seen food as a trivial thing, not part of our national identity, and in no serious way a connection to nature and the source of life. But fixing that is what we're about, and veganism can help. So considerations. If you are one of the people that put your hands up and said that veganism is the answer, consider the boom in sales of ultra-processed vegan food over the last 5 years. Ultra-processed foods are what we now know to be the key link between what we eat and sickness. But the boom in our vegan processed foods has done wonders for the bottom lines of Unilever, Kraft, etc., and the fast food chains. Making vegan processed food is nearly as cheap as making ultra-processed food from non-vegan ingredients. And once they scale it up, it's going to be even cheaper. And the key for them is that, this sales pitch, they can charge the customer a great deal more. Vegan ultra-processed foods depend on the same monocropped ingredients as non-vegan processed foods, and perhaps even more dependent on the vegetable oils that have been such a disaster for our health. They push up the levels of omega-3 in our diets, and that has a very now extremely well-documented effects on our circulation and our brain function. So beware that kind of greenwashing. For example, almond milk. I thought I would see some almond milk on sale here, but I haven't actually so far. I just saw hazelnut. But my son, who hasn't fallen far from the parental tree, makes podcasts in the United States. And he made a series called Nut Jobs, which is on Audible, which I recommend to you who would like to understand something about the industrial food system. What that shows in the place where 90% of the world's almonds come from is a system so bleak, so environmentally damaging, so damaging to the people who work there. It's a disaster. So this unthinking, nut milks are better necessarily than milk from a cow is not a proposition that I think stands up. Also, monocropping to produce vegan foods, such as alternative meats and dairy, it damages soils. See, there's somebody who's bored already, right? Monocropping, the same crop on the same land all the time, no rotations, to produce alternative meats and berries and processed foods. It does the same damage to the soils. It overuses water in just the same way as growing soya and corn for animal feed. So I'd say, if you want to save the world, go vegan. But make sure it's based on vegetables, whole grains, pulses, and so on. Look at the societies that do thrive on near vegan diets. Be skeptical of the claims of the alternative meat and dairy industry that's big on patents. I mean, we're talking about patented food, most of these things. And they're very reluctant to reveal the details on ingredients or the energy costs. And that stuff is also attracting billions of dollars in investment from the high-tech companies that already control far too much of our lives in mind. Work to ban factory farming if you can. Make them the stranded assets that have no future, that some of the new breed of global investors already able to be. Work to get cooking and gardening back into primary schools so that you grow a new generation who know what real food is. Question what we spend public research money on. Why isn't there more research on pasture farming and the ability of soils to sequester carbon? We live in a country, as you know, where I don't even know the percentage anymore, but it's I mean, you know where we right. What percentage of the country is hills and cover crops? I mean, it's vast. Simon?
Well, it's arable land. I'm not.
Well, it's anyway. Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about land. I'm talking about moorland. I'm talking about the place, large areas of Scotland that you cannot do anything. I mean, George Monbiot differently, but where you certainly can't grow cod, and where it seems to make sense to raise animals. As Patrick Holden, head of the Sustainable Food Trust, put it, it's not the cow, but the how. And you'll hear far, far more detail on that from someone. So I'd say we need to embrace complexity, stop looking for simple solutions, become more knowledgeable about the farming systems that are part of the problem and those that are part of the solution. We need to think.
Thank you, Sheila, very much. Okay, I'm not going to take questions now, sorry, but there will be plenty of time afterwards. I think in some ways it was so complete what Sheila said that I don't want to break that bubble yet. So we'll let Simon have his presentation, and then Alice, and then we'll ask a few questions and discussion after that. There will be plenty of time. Okay, Simon, on to you.
Well, we need to think, and I think better standing up. I think. I'm going to ask the audience, how many people here support or are in favour of factory farm pig and chicken? Oh dear. Well, that's that out of it. We won't bother with that then. I'm going to talk about other means of rearing livestock and animals for milk and meat. And along with Tara Garnett and some other people, we've developed a concept that I call default livestock. Tara Garnett prefers to call it leftovers, ecological leftovers, but it basically refers to that part of the livestock sector that is a co-product or a byproduct of the greater agroeconomic system, which factory farms are not. The factory farms, grain is grown deliberately and for the sole purpose of feeding pork and chicken, and it causes all sorts of problems that I'm not going to talk about, as you already know. Default livestock involves animals that are part of our agricultural system. And in fact, the default is a term used by the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, initially. And there are a number of sorts of livestock that fit into this category, some arguably, some disputably. The obvious ones are, look, for example, with grazing animals. Now, there is a dispute about whether we should allocate land like this to livestock or to some other use, like rewilding or energy or amenity or whatever. And I'm not going to go down that road. But what is indisputable is that a certain amount of grazing is necessary simply to provide things that we need. For example, to preserve biodiversity, there are a large number of people doing conservation grazing. If you've got solar panels or wind turbines, then you need something to clear the ground around. In fact, any time you need open space rather than trees, the only ecological way at the moment is to do it with livestock. Otherwise, you use petrol, right? So a certain amount of livestock is used for useful forms of grazing. Another form of default livestock is as a co-product of an organic rotation. And organic rotations rely on grass. You cannot do, by grass I mean a collection of actually quite biodiverse grouping of plants, including grass, but also including legumes such as clover, lucerne, sainfoin, and so forth. And you cannot do organic agriculture without having something like this in your rotation. Now, you can disc that stuff in, or otherwise incorporate it into the ground, and grow your potatoes or your wheat or whatever it is without using any animals at all. That's perfectly possible. And that's called stockless husbandry. But if you feed the clover and grass through cows, and particularly dairy cows, this works really well for, you get the bonus of a very large amount of milk and meat, whilst most of the nitrogen that you're trying to capture through the clover, etc., either passes through the cow and out the other end and can be composted, and then a good half of it is in the stolons and the roots of the clover that the cows can't even eat. So you're feeding your cows without really harming the fertility building side of your farming system. You're getting a mixed farming system, which is perhaps a bit more extravagant on space than stockless rotation, but on the other hand produces a much wider and more nourishing form of protein and a wider variety of goods. But another form of default agriculture, which isn't very relevant here, but it's very relevant in places like India, is animals are required for traction. If we get away from fossil fuels, then more animals will be required for traction, normally cows. And if you're going to rear cows for traction, then you are automatically going to have milk and beef as a byproduct of that, which is why India at the moment is the world's largest producer of milk, and the milk it produces is by far the most important, or no, I would say that, but it's an important component in ensuring that the poorer people of India get sufficient protein. It's that what the white revolution in India has been a huge benefit to a great many people. But the biggest form of default livestock of all is the ability of both cows and pigs and chickens to mop up waste. And there are various forms of waste. There's waste that's produced. It isn't really waste, it's actually part of the circular system, but let's call it waste, because they like to call it waste. You get crop residues, and then when the crops are taken to market and processed, you get processing residues, and then when it goes to restaurants or to domestic dining rooms, you get food waste. Now, the amount that is currently fed to livestock is not insignificant. According to one expert, Sir Mr. Fardell, all the co-products of that are used at the moment are sufficient to feed the entire world's dairy industry, right? A woman called Hannah Van Santen did a calculation of the amount of processing waste that a vegan diet generated. And she worked out that it produced 129 kilos of food And this 129 kilos fed to livestock produced, in her estimation, 14 grams of protein a day, which is sufficient, which provide a quarter of everybody's, the entire world's protein requirements. And this is completely free. It's, in fact, it's more than free. At the moment, they don't know what to do with half of this stuff. Well, no, I'm sorry, I take that back. The processing waste is fed to cows, but the food waste that's coming out of kitchens and canteens and people's houses, at the moment, is a liability. Local authorities have to pay to dispose of it by getting it burnt, or even landfilling it. All this, for reasons I'm not going to get into, it's actually illegal to feed it to pigs at the moment, though we do it, and we get, I'm in a bit of a tussle about that. If we went vegan, we would lose all this, and it all becomes something of a liability Now, the second, one of the aspects of this is that although pigs are pretty good at mopping up human food waste, the stuff that we like, but it's gone off, or we had too much, we throw it away. Kitchen food waste is best fed to pigs, but most of the processing waste is best fed to cows because it's much more fibrous, and it's if you're feeding it to cows, then by far the most efficient way of doing it is through the dairy industry, because dairy produces 3 times as much nourishment per hectare of land as beef. The problem that's levelled against cows, as Sheila mentioned, is their methane emissions. Now, the problem with that is that the way methane emissions have been calculated over the last 20 years is fundamentally wrong. It's inaccurate. Nobody denies this. They recognised that it was a fudge when they first introduced it 20 years ago. The reason is that basically they translated into CO2 equivalent, i.e. an equivalent of carbon dioxide, but it's not immediately translatable because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere and accumulates in the atmosphere, gets worse and worse and worse. Whereas methane has quite a high effect immediately, but then it disappears from the atmosphere, nearly all of it in about 40 years. What this means is that if you have a stable emissions of methane, i.e. if you have the same amount of cows over 40 years, the amount of methane that they're putting into the atmosphere is balanced by the amount that's actually coming out. They're not. If you've got a stable rate of emissions of methane, you are not adding any global warming, increasing global warming at all, because you've got the cooling effect from the methane that was 40 or 30 years old disappearing while you're pumping more in. A stable number of cows producing the same amount of methane do not cause global warming. And this is recognised, it's undeniable, the whole business has been elaborated in detail by Oxford scientists. Nobody's challenging it, but none of the numerous papers that are comparing cow emissions with, say, car emissions or cow emissions with vegan emissions, almost none of them yet acknowledge that they are doing this inaccurately. Now, there is another thing. Of course, if the number of cows are increasing, then that will increase the amount of global warming. Now, if anybody's read George Monbiot's recent book called Regenesis, they'll see a passage fairly closely in about the number of cows in the world, right? And now, George, with whom I have a sort of adversarial friendship, sent me a copy of his book, and in it said that the cows, that over the last 50 years, the number of cows in the world have increased by 50%. And I thought, what? So I went back to the US Department of Agriculture figures, which seemed to be the most valuable one, and I looked at them, and I wrote back to George, and I said, look, this is just not true, according to the USDA. Since 1975, the number of cows in the world has been stable. The number of cows in Britain has gone down by 30% over that time. When his book came out, yes, George had altered the figure, and what he wrote was that in the last 50 years, the number of cows in the world has gone up by 15%. Right? Well, that's true. In the last 50 years, it's gone up by 15%. But all of that 15% happened between 1971 and 1975. In the last 45 years, it's been stable. In fact, the number of cows in the world is slightly less than it was in 1975. Now, none of this is taken into account in these heated debates about cow obesity. I'm not saying that cows don't have any environmental impact. We all do. But at the moment, there are an awful lot of academics who are putting out figures that they know are simply wrong. 1 minute. Okay, to finish, I just want you to picture a graph, and this graph shows the amount of carbon emissions and global warming that's gone on in the world. And so we're like 10,000 BC, 1,000 BC, 1,000 AD, 1800 AD, 1850 AD, 2020. It goes whoop like that, right? Now you look at the use of fossil fuels, and it does exactly the same thing. It goes up like that. You look at the amount of livestock in the world, and that's both domestic livestock and things like bison and wildebeest in Africa and so forth, and it doesn't go like that. It kind of goes a little bit up, and then it goes a bit more up, and then it levels out for ruminants, about methane-emitting ruminants. The statistical connection between ruminants and global warming is negligible compared to the statistical connection between fossil fuel use and global warming. And to blame animals, livestock, for global warming, it's just totally missing the point. It is fossil fuels, as Sheila said, emit just as much methane as cows do, and whose CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere and makes the world hotter and hotter. And targeting livestock in terms of global warming is a total distraction, and it should be immediately debunked.
Thank you very much, Simon. Right, Alice, are you getting your technology worked out? Or give me we had another one here, so. Okay, thank you, excellent. Right, one more. From this time from Alice. Over to you, Alice. You want to stand or sit?
Is that all right for everyone on there? I've got a bit wild on this. Sorry, everyone. Buckle up. Okay. Firstly, kind of want to talk to you about India and also swill feeding, but I'll save it till the end. But just to recognise that this is such an enormous topic, it goes well beyond talking about animals and agriculture, and I want to just offer I'm sure that's okay. Offer a definition of veganism to start, just to, because you sort of gave your thoughts on that one. So very simply, veganism is a philosophy. It's an ethical stance that describes a way of living to cause the least harm possible, and it seeks to exclude the exploitation and cruelty towards others. That extends beyond animals and agriculture to those used in other ways, to those in the wild, and also to our fellow humans. So as Herbie said, I'm an ex-pig vet. Why listen to me? Why listen to activists, to whistleblowers, to vegans in general? When you hear someone say, and we hear it a lot, of course vegans are going to be anti-meat, so they have an agenda. What agenda do you think that is? Who is it that benefits from keeping the public in the dark in order to sell you a product? I gave up the career I spent my entire life working towards. Whistleblowers face legal, financial, social, and health consequences for speaking out against former industries. Looking at every social justice movement, historically and today, suffragettes, civil rights movement, environmental activists, they've all suffered a great detriment to create change. At first they're mocked, then violently opposed, and then eventually society catches up. Conversely, I've seen activists and friends in the last few years be punched, kicked, beaten with metal bars, spades, spat at. A woman was killed by a slaughterhouse truck for holding a sign outside. People have been camping outside the beagle breeding facility in Cambridgeshire listening to puppies screaming for over a year. People are risking their lives in tunnels, up trees, in roads, on hunger strike. None of this is fun. None of us are paid to be doing it. And I just ask that you listen with an open mind to people who are trying to create change. Conversely, the livestock, pharmaceutical, and allied industries have a very obvious financial agenda, and they have many billions of pounds to throw at marketing, advertising, media, buying scientists, funding dodgy science studies, and exert a great deal of power over government policymakers, as Sheila points out. This is no different to how the tobacco and fossil fuel industries have operated. I've got a lot of stats in here, so just some quick figures. Human population is obviously 8 billion people. We slaughter 80 billion land animals each year for food, plus 2 to 3 trillion aquatic animals. The livestock population is increasing nearly 2.5 times as fast as the human population. Here in the UK, we eat 82 kilos of meat a year per person on average, compared to the global average of 43 kilos. This is where it starts to become a justice issue, a poverty issue, which obviously we're all very passionate about. An estimated 1 billion people are undernourished, going hungry in the world. The travesty is that we already grow enough food to feed 10 to 14 billion people, but 50% of world calories grown are fed to livestock, including a third of edible fish. 25,000 people die every day from starvation, yet we can feed those 80 billion land animals and 160 billion farmed fish to slaughter each year. Since we're focusing on ruminants heavily here, we're talking about extensive grazing, etc. To produce ruminant meat, it requires about 20 to 30 kilos of feed to produce 1 kilo of edible flesh, depending on conditions. We also provide comprehensive health care to these animals in the form of vaccines, hormones, antimicrobials, while 2 billion people lack access to even basic antibiotics. I have a lot of board stats. I have a lot of stats, if anybody's got questions to clarify anything. But I think really all I need to say on water is that a third of the world's population lack access to safe water and even more to safe sanitation. Meanwhile, a third of global water use, freshwater use, is for livestock production. This is the single biggest user. We are no different in the UK. It is the same here as everywhere. That seems like a simple fix to me. A third lacking access to safe water, a third of freshwater use goes to livestock, which we don't need. Land use. This should arguably be the number one metric we use to determine the impact of foods, as it is all land that cannot be used by wild ecosystems upon which we depend to survive. I had a few scathing comments a bit about rewilding this morning, but really, that is what we need to do to avert a climate disaster that's going to kill all of us. That is the bottom line. The UK diet requires 1.4 times the land that we actually farm here. Global figures, 28% of the world's land is pasture, compared to 1% urban land for human living. That 28% is providing us with just 1% of our protein. The figures are even more stark here in the UK. Livestock pasture and grazing occupies 51% of our land. According to NASA, livestock production is the number one driver of deforestation by a long way, along with causing ocean dead zones, habitat loss, and species extinction. It's responsible for 80% of deforestation this century and 91% of Amazon rainforest destruction. Indigenous communities are slaughtered to make way for grazing and feed crops. Since 1988, an area larger than California has been cleared from the rainforest. You might ask why I'm talking about something that's happening way over in South America. We actually use over 1 million hectares of destroyed Amazon forest land for feeding our livestock. And we import feed from other places too. We already cleared our temperate rainforest a long time ago here in the UK. We are now a decimated landscape. In the introduction to this debate, this area is described as rural idylls, but what I see is blank green fields with no biodiversity. Woodland represents just 10% of our land, and we do amazingly well to convince people that this is a green and pleasant land. Looking at the land required to produce 100 grams of different types of protein, soya is always mentioned when talking about veganism. To produce 100 grams of soy in the form of tofu, you need 2 square meters of land. Chicken, 7 square meters. Pork, 10. Milk, 27. Beef, 163. And lamb, 185 square meters. If we switch to plant-based diets, we could free up 76% of agricultural land, returning all the pastures to wild. That is the most key point here. We really need those forests to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And we'd reduce arable land by 19% as well. We could very easily be self-sufficient in the UK, feeding the entire population, including those who are malnourished at the moment, on healthy diets, as well as combating the climate crisis with actual carbon sinks. The organic fallacy, I thought we may come across today. If England and Wales switched to 100% organic animal production, we would require 40% extra land. Greenhouse gas emissions are similar or worse, depending on which study you look at, in organic animals, because they are less efficient and require more land and feed. They create up to 37% more nitrogen pollution with their manure than conventional fertilizers. Free-range chickens lay a carpet of reactive phosphate on the ground to be washed into rivers at far higher concentrations than any farm would spread manure. 300 square metres of dead zone in Wales is caused by sheep grazing. We've heard today that we have a lot of land that is not suitable for anything other than grazing, and that's used as an excuse because we've already decimated that land with grazing and now we're just leaving the sheep there. Some areas can only support 1 sheep per 10 hectares. That is how destroyed it is. 22% of the entire farmed area in the UK is used for sheep, and yet it is just 1% of our food. We are on very dodgy ground with the less but better rhetoric that we hear very often. Not just that it doesn't add up, factually, but it becomes somewhat of a classist argument. The NEPA state is one that people look to quite often, and the reality of regenerative farming, if we take that model, which is great for rewilding, perfect, but if we roll it out as a food production model across, say, 10% of our farmland, we would provide enough dead animal for 1 meal per year of meat. That would be the reality of that. This is equivalent to a 99.5% cut in meat consumption, at which point You might ask what you're doing. That was the original Nep estate story. They're actually now tripling their herd, mob grazing on pasture, which I'd like to talk about later, and overwintering in barns in order to turn a profit. So that poster child has been sullied by conventional farming. Grass-fed, pasture-fed, what a superb marketing term. One paper looked at the suggestion of people in the US switching to entirely pasture-fed beef, which is often called for by meat enthusiasts and foodies. It found that even if the US felled every single tree, drained its wetlands, watered its deserts, destroyed its national parks, they would still need to import beef on the pasture-fed model. Grazing, lots of sighs to my right. Grazing is responsible for 40% of food industry deforestation. Doesn't matter if it's happened now or in the past. What we're seeing is obviously active deforestation in the Amazon, which we're all focusing on, but we've done it all here already. It is 3 times more destructive than palm oil. I kind of know what will be said of these examples that I'm using here, that what we're advocating for is a lower consumption of meat, which of course it is, and I totally appreciate that. However, what it does is gives people excuses, it gives people hooks to excuse continued meat consumption. And the agricultural giants are laughing all the way to the bank with that bit of marketing for them, meanwhile putting small farmers out of business. If we're being sensible, we'll be helping those small farmers to produce products that are actually sustainable and have a good future prospect. No amount of animal farming is sustainable or good for the environment. Where livestock are kept, large predators are killed by farmers or by lobbying government to do it for them. We obviously have none left in the UK to do that. Of the 28,000 species known to be at imminent risk of extinction, 24,000 are due to farming. A review of over 100 studies found that when livestock are removed from land, the abundance and diversity of almost all groups of wild animals increases. Someone's doing really well on that game. Animal agriculture is, once again, I'm going to keep having this, once again, a main driver of air, water and soil pollution, at which point I'm going to signpost to Tim Bailey's book. He is a UK leading pollution expert, farm pollution expert, and has totted up all the UK data on livestock's impact on our environment. The book is called Livestock's Longer Shadow. Greenhouse gases. A 2013 UN FAO report stated that livestock are responsible for more greenhouse gases than all transport combined. This is often looked at as something which is an over-exaggeration. However, that report was prepared by livestock specialists, not environmentalists. The International Meat Association were involved and partnered with European Feed Manufacturing Federation, International Dairy Federation, International Meat Secretariat, International Poultry Council, International Egg Commission, worth over $1 trillion. These bodies will have made sure that that was the absolute lowest estimation they could get away with, and it's still more than all transport combined. Plenty more figures like that, but we'll move on because there's quite a lot. Essentially, if everybody switched to a plant-based diet, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 60 to 80%. Let's not forget that our biggest carbon sink is the ocean. The number one driver of ocean dead zones is animal agriculture, and obviously fishing is destroying the ocean. There's a really good segment on a documentary called Eating Our Way to Extinction on fishing and fish farming particularly, which I've had verified by people who work in that industry. Okay, local. Local is another buzzword that we love to use. For pasture-fed ruminant meat, transport accounts for 0.5 to 2% of emissions. 95% is raising the animals themselves. You would have to ship a kilo of dried peas 100 times around the world before its greenhouse gases match that of 1 kilo of local beef. Air freight accounts for 0.16 total emissions from food. One study found that eating plant-based 1 day per week had a larger positive environmental impact than eating 100% local. I'd like to just add to that local myth. Obviously, as a livestock vet, my main area is ethics. I've obviously done a lot of reading on environment and human health, etc. A lot of work in pandemics and antimicrobial resistance recently, but welfare was my main thing. And the local myth, there seems to be a perception that this somehow has bearing on welfare. In my experience, farms supplying butchers, farm shops, can be just as bad, if not worse, than what we might class as intensive farms. In fact, sometimes what happens is that the contractor will be so bad at caring for their animals, they will have their supply cut off by the big corporate, and in seeking somewhere else to sell their pigs, might strike up a deal with the local butcher. Sorry, this is so rapid fire, everyone. I hope it's all right. It would be remiss of me not to mention antimicrobial resistance. Dame Sally Davies, the UK's special envoy on antimicrobial resistance and the ex-chief medical officer of the government, even before the shocking latest figures were released, said that this was something that would kill us before climate change. So this is really something that needs to come into the conversation. Those latest figures are deaths associated with antimicrobial resistance have leapt sevenfold in the last 5 years, from 700,000 deaths a year to 5 million associated deaths. Interesting that the largest ever review of evidence found that only 5% of papers found no convincing link between agricultural use of antibiotics and human resistance, while 75% found a convincing link. Yet I've never heard Dame Sally Davies mention the world's largest user. Worldwide, almost 3/4 of antibiotics go into livestock. Here we're about a third, but don't let that reduced total figure fool you. We still massively overuse them and misuse them in ways that select for resistance, running the risk of leaving ourselves riddled with superbugs and without the use of our life-saving medicines that we currently take for granted. Once again, not a problem completely isolated to intensive farms, in my experience. I can give it my best shot. I've got a whole section on economics. Subsidies have been mentioned. Taxing, I think, has been mentioned, or I've heard somebody talk about that before. But the cost of an animal-based food system needs to be something that's brought in as well, given the level of poverty and food scarcity. So subsidies cost the taxpayer about $3 billion a year in the UK. Industries get bailouts when things go wrong, like we're seeing with the pig industry currently. The cost of endemic disease in livestock in the UK reaches hundreds of millions of pounds in mitigation strategies every year, often stretching to billions when an unexpected outbreak occurs. One example, bovine tuberculosis costs British taxpayers a hefty £150 million each year, with over 500 government staff involved in disease control. That's just one disease. There are many, many endemic diseases in the mix. Foot and mouth cost $8 billion in 2001. We must consider the costs of disease surveillance, testing, vaccines, biosecurity treatment, lab costs, veterinary services, research and development. These are all things that we've now come to get used to with COVID. Add to that human health costs for foodborne disease. Particularly alarming, foodborne disease costs the UK $9 billion a year, considering we are a country with high food safety standards. Obviously, foodborne disease comes only from animal feces. And when it goes completely wild with a pandemic, obviously, we're talking trillions. A recent article quoting health professionals estimates that the NHS could save $30 billion if everyone followed a plant-based diet. We must also consider the cost of pollution and climate change driven by these industries. I have a whole section on ethics, which I'm sure will probably come up in the sort of discussion afterwards. So I'll maybe leave that for now. But I just have one short section to talk about, which I think is also really important, and it's something that's affected me personally. The social consequences. Consider the consequences in a society of a food system based on violence. And that's what it is. We are exploiting, we are murdering sentient beings who are intelligent, sentient, feel the same way that we do, suffer the same way that we do. We also practice violent blood sports, use animals in fashion, cosmetics, entertainment, however we fancy. Unsurprisingly, that can ripple out as violence. Higher rates of domestic abuse have been recorded in slaughterhouse workers. And again, slaughterhouses are also not completely confined to the intensive farming industry. That's every animal is going into a slaughterhouse. High rates of domestic abuse, major mental health issues and suicide, violent crime, murder. My own brother was brutally murdered in 2020 by a Somerset livestock farmer. Abusing animals is a very well documented precursor to violence and even murder of humans, including the recent Texas school shooter. We don't freely carry guns in this country, thankfully, but those that are permitted to keep and use firearms are those that wish to kill animals, wild and domestic, either as part of their systemic exploitation in an agricultural context or for some form of entertainment. I hope I'm not the only person that can see a problem with that. We're being inadvertently taught from birth and the concept reinforced throughout our lives that it's acceptable, normal, and in fact encouraged to take the freedoms away from and murder other beings because they are different to us. They look different, they don't speak the same language. We know that they feel anatomically, physiologically, much the same way we do. We know that they suffer in the same way. But we're told that it's extreme to not want to inflict harm on others. Can you think where that sort of attitude has arisen in history? I'm feeling there's a little worrying basis of this sort of normalised thinking. Colonialism, slavery, genocide. It's all on the same basis of seeing those that may be different to us in ways that are not important as objects that we can exploit and inflict suffering upon when we don't need to do so. I'm going to pause there. I've barely even scratched the surface, but those are some issues that they're obviously far more extensive than that. But I would like to just end with a question for you. Which is more important, your taste preferences, your sensory pleasure for a 15-minute meal, or the lives of billions of people, the planet and its ecosystems that we need to survive, food, medicines, water, your own health, and the suffering on the part of the animals used for food? If we had a fresh slate, what would we do? Thankfully, we're in a position to take this matter into our own hands and vote with our wallets. And we cannot wait for policy change because it will be decades too late, as we've seen with fossil fuels. Just take a second to imagine a better way of living and hold on to that.
Right. Thank you, Alice, very much. A bit of a tour de force there of arguments and statistics. Okay, going to open the debate to the floor.
That's better. Yeah, I agree with most of what's been said, and I thought Alice did a very good summary there. I do think you need to take issue with the dairy industry and stop making excuses for it. I mean, it is a horrible industry. I have my doubts about whether the actual beef industry produces more carbon than actually dairy industry, particularly in this country. When you take into account the fertilizers that goes into forage crops, etc., let alone the cruelty, which I hope you'll pass on to your youngsters and those with animals, pet animals, because you don't treat those. You treat those a lot better than you do the cars that are a byproduct of the milk. But that's another story. What I did want to inquire, or also what the second point I wanted to make about the dairy industry, in my locality, which is quite a dairy-intensive area, we grew a lot of legumes in one year because we had a problem with one of the forage crops. And that led me to think that we should be pushing for more legume production. It's not impossible in this country, which deals with the issue of air miles, the issue of palm oil, the issue of soya and this sort of thing. And if we pursue the vegan route, we should really be looking to eat peas, broad beans, that side of thing, that sort of stuff that can be produced locally, or at least in Europe. One area which really I have to agree with, which I hate and it horrifies me, is the cheapness of food. And I agree with them, it's been a government policy for many years. Give people cheap food, and you don't need to pay them so much, and etc., etc. And I hope you remember that next time you're at the ballot box. But I wonder whether one of the other solutions, which wasn't touched on, Sheila, I know, knows a bit about this, which might be an interim solution. It's something I've been investigating myself, and that is firms such as, or investment trusts such as Agronomics, which are looking at meat cell fermentation, which is a way to satisfy maybe a stopgap towards veganism, where we produce meat in fermenters, as we do with antibiotics, as we do with yeasts, as we do with many other products. And I wondered if the panel would like to comment on that, about cell meat from cell manufacture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll gather a couple of more questions and then we'll ask the panel to comment.
Hello, I'm quite nervous to talk in front of everyone. So it's obviously a super complex and super emotional issue. And I think the way you describe veganism is beautiful, but it's very idealistic, because in my experience of working in food industry for a while and working as a chef in a vegan cafe, I see that there is a trend towards veganism that's happening at the moment that doesn't seem like it's based in ethics. It seems like it's a trend. It seems like it's very successful marketing by companies like Oatly, which is owned by Unilever, which is a highly, it's a bad company. And so are many of the leading vegan brands owned by fad companies. And I just wonder if it's being taken into account the way that vegans are eating as a general trend, which is a lot of processed food, as I'm seeing. I'm sure that there are loads of vegans out there who eat lots of Suma, bulk order lentils and stuff like that, but there's also a lot of shipping happening, and as was mentioned before, a lot of processing. So is the water usage and the space that's being used being taken into account in what you're talking about? Are you taking into account the shipping that's happening of things like avocados, the ethics of buying avocados, and how many things like that vegans are eating? Avocados, coconut, cacao, coffee. Of course, people who aren't following plant-based diets also eat this way, but when you're eating a vegan diet, presumably, if you're looking after your health, you're supplementing a lot, because it's not healthy to eat a diet that doesn't have fats, proteins. The thing with meats that I have read, and obviously I'm not an expert, what I've read will be biased because studies are paid for by people who want a certain outcome, which is something else I would like to highlight. What I've read is that meat offers a complete protein which isn't as accessible in a plant-based diet. So I'm wondering also about the supplementation that goes beyond eating. Products like Huel coming up, this is a non-food product. And other non-food products, like you can buy this milkshake thing now called This Is Food, which ironically the ingredients don't look very edible to me. And these things are marketed towards plant-based eaters to supplement a diet which is deficient. And then for me it also becomes a public health issue, because indigenous communities historically throughout humankind have been eating meat. So there's also maybe a slight issue there with how we talk about people's diets, because are we now demonizing indigenous people who are eating in a sustainable and considered way that have been sustaining their communities for centuries? Sorry, I'm losing track of my own thoughts. So are we demonizing those diets? And obviously there's an issue with the way that meat is being farmed, but I'm not necessarily seeing a perfect model of farming in plant-based diets, because monocultures are a real problem. And the way that that affects soil is going to be a massive problem, because it's not sustainable. And the other impactful thing that comes from a vegan diet in terms of soil is the way that we deal with food waste and household waste. And obviously there's also the processing waste that comes from the vegan diet, which is being mentioned before. But it's interesting to see that there's actually a kind of symbiotic relationship between farming and this processing waste. And I wonder if there's a way for these two models of diets to coexist without such a lot of...
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, well, you built any good style. Okay.
Hi, I'll keep this quick. I just thought there were so many good points made on the complexities and intricacies of our diet and how difficult it is to unpick those, and how I think nobody in this room is in support of factory farming. And yet I was really disappointed that most of those statistics were muddied with factory farming. And that's what makes this really difficult and polarizes people. I'm using terms like people are exploiting animals. It's just really insulting to farmers that really care for their animals. And when we've heard about how this is all in balance and in sync, and we're using waste for the animals, it just feels really upsetting and really polarizing. And yeah.
Thank you. Swans. Are you all waiting? Okay, yeah, go on. Just very quickly.
Yeah. Hi. I just was wondering. How would you get? I completely agree with veganism. I'm not personally a vegan, but I definitely think that there should be a goal in the world for everyone to go more plant-based. How would you achieve this? I don't think it's going to happen through encouraging the power of the money of consumers' money, because you're not going to convince everyone with your arguments. How would that work? Would you need state involvement? Would you need I don't know. How do you achieve like everyone going vegan if that's the end goal?
Okay, thank you.
A lot of it is obviously aimed at veganism, so I'll try and remember what I've scribbled here. So factory farming, yes, get your point. A lot of those statistics I then obviously did try to tailor for the discussion that we're having. However, the reality is that over 90% of meat is coming from factory farms. So like I said, there's an excuse of, I buy local, I buy free range, but actually that's just not the reality when you look at the consumption patterns of meat. I am actually taking the UK government to court over factory farming at the moment. If you go to scrapfactoryfarming.org, there is a lot of information on that. We're going to the European Court of Human Rights on that one for the pandemic antimicrobial resistance issues. I couldn't tell if that was feedback from my microphone. Okay, gosh, there's so much. So how do we fix this? How do we achieve a vegan world, a vegan diet that's sustainable? So somebody mentioned cultured meat, a brilliant way to start that off, particularly for people who enjoy the taste of meat. It's a much lower impact way of doing it. It obviously needs further investment in scaling up. It obviously then doesn't involve the animals being killed as well. Precision fermentation is something which is going to be huge, I think. This is probably the main thing that we're going to get, and that is using microbes, so bacteria, etc., to create whatever sort of food, fat content, food stuff that we want, and we can make that into essentially whatever we want. So precision fermentation. Veganic farming, there's a chap called Ian Tolhurst, if you want to look him up, who does all vegan farming. He has no animal inputs whatsoever. He gets yields that are the same as conventional farming. He uses fertilizers, but it's all veganic. So it's totally possible. He also works on land which is not even considered agricultural. It's so poor. So there are certainly ways of doing it. Obviously, scaling down, that's not something which can be done as an industrial farming situation. And I certainly appreciate that we can't go from one situation that we're in now to the other overnight. These are ways that we need to be moving, and certainly bringing the farming community into that and encouraging ways of producing food for ourselves. It's going to be hard to do it. There's also perennial grains, vertical farming. And I'll say again, we grow enough food to feed 10 to 14 billion people already. It's just that 50% of that is going into livestock. So it wouldn't be a case of extra land needed to feed people. It would be much, much less. And it's already ready for agriculture, if that makes sense. Where else did we go with that? We went to avocados, coconuts, etc. Complete protein, that's a myth. You get complete protein from plants. I can't see the lady that asked that one. yeah, complete protein you get from plants. You get a diverse array of proteins from plants. The NHS and many credible health bodies recognise that veganism is a healthy diet for all stages of life, including pregnancy, lactation, babies. So it's not something that you go vegan and you're going to get deficient. Everybody should be supplementing with B12. That is one thing that is actually higher in meat eaters than vegans, believe it or not. But yeah, so supplementing B12 and D is what people should be doing anyway. Otherwise, you can get everything absolutely abundantly on a vegan diet with no problem. The only deficiency I've suffered in the last 5 years is in my patience, probably, with vegan questions. No, I'm just kidding. Where else do we go? Indigenous people. Certainly nobody is suggesting that we go into Indigenous communities and tell them to stop eating what they're eating. That would be absolutely ridiculous. What I'm suggesting is that people in a situation able to, you can go and choose whatever food you want at the supermarket, at the shop, at your farm shop. You have the ability to make those choices. I'm presuming, given the audience I'm talking to, we are all in a position to buy plant-based food. Likewise, nobody is suggesting that a processed food diet is healthy or good for the planet. Certainly environmentally, it is still better than meat, but I absolutely get the point on the plastic, on processing, and it's not good for human health. Nobody is suggesting that that's a good thing. A whole food plant-based diet is the only diet proven to reverse cardiovascular disease, reverse type 2 diabetes, and prevent many different types of cancer. So from a human health perspective, it is super if you get it right. But that's the same with every diet. There are many people living on processed junk meat, like Burger King and McDonald's. Monocrops have been mentioned a couple of times. Most of the monocrops obviously are going into livestock, and a lot of pastured grass is a monocrop. So we already have a lot of monocrops on the go, and most of those are for livestock. Obviously, if you think when you're feeding animals, less care is going into whether we're using GMOs, whether we're using pesticides, fertilizers, because it's not going into human consumption. So these are all issues which are propagated much more by livestock production anyway.
Can we hear some other panels?
Yeah, sorry.
Let's
That's all right.
Okay,
It's
done.
because they're all aimed at veganism, so I figured that was...
No, that's fair enough. Okay, Simon, do you want to?
Yeah. Hello. Yes, well, I agree with the lady who said that all these objections are, most of which I agree with, are aimed at industrial agriculture. You mentioned Livestock's Long Shadow, which claimed that 18%. What? No. Long Shadow, please. Livestock's Long Shadow, which claimed that livestock production was caused more global warming than cars, and then you gave a long list of the supporters of this document, and all those institutions are industrial agriculture. The reason why they supported that document, which anyway they had to reduce from 18% of global warming to 40%, the reason why they supported it is because the subtext of the document was to get rid of small-scale peasant farmers and to push for what they regard as being the most efficient form of agriculture, which is putting grain into pork and chicken. And if anybody doesn't believe me, it's explained in this book here. I am a small-scale dairy farmer. I have 8 acres. I've got 2 cows at the moment. I have had 3. The land I work is mostly grade 4 agricultural land. You quoting either George Monbiot or The World in Data quoted figures saying that 27 square meters are needed for every 100 meters of protein. Well, I questioned this. I worked it out for myself. On the rough land that I do, with only pasture-fed cows, it requires 10 cubic meters for each 100 grams of protein. I wrote to George Monbiot about this, and I said, look, these figures don't make sense, and I know about this. He didn't change the figures. My cows are basically, first of all, I again agree with the very eloquent lady who said it's an insult to cow farmers. I'm not going to make any apologies for large-scale dairy farmers who have basically pushed out hundreds and thousands of small family farms. But my cows are fed. What I do for the cows is to produce hay in the summer, which is what this festival happens to be all about, in fact, because they cannot feed themselves through the winter. In the wild situation, large numbers of animals die, and they die in a way that is far more brutal than anything that goes on even in the worst factory farms. And it certainly doesn't go on in my farm, where I have an extremely good relationship with Folly and Coco. We have our little tussles, but they know what side their bread is buttered. They know that I give them food that they can't get, and I think they also know that actually, when they have a medical problem, I come and look after it and sort it out. They don't know that what I will also ensure is that they have a painless death. Nature doesn't do this, and the accusations of cruelty against livestock farmers are, for the most part, an absolute calumny compared to what goes on in nature. My cows produce 4,000 litres of milk each, 8,000 off about six acres. That works out about 1,000 litres per acre, which is enough to feed one person. This is on land that you cannot grow any crops. What are you going to do with it instead? Well, you can rewild it. What does rewilding involve with? It involves a load of bracken and brambles coming in and retaking it, and then eventually it will all go to forest. Okay, we need some more trees. But there were farmers throughout history who spent huge amounts of energy clearing that land to produce human food. And before we let it all go back to bracken and brambles, then I think we need to think a bit harder.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, can I just say one thing?
One more thing. I'm sorry for those who lined up to ask more questions or make statements. We've run out of time, so I really apologise for chairing this so badly that I haven't given you space. But anyway, so Sheila is going to have the last word.
I have the last word. I have the utmost respect for anyone who gives up eating animals because they feel that animals should not be killed. But I thought we were addressing the question of, can veganism save the world? Veganism cannot save the world because we have this highly industrialized food system. And that highly industrialized food system will go on, whether it's killing animals or it's producing vegan food. And there may be less drastic outcomes of crop production, but we will still have really very difficult problems if we go on producing food in the same way. And I agree completely with the woman who said that it's disrespect to small farmers who do farm properly and have great respect for their animals. And I've met, in my career as a food journalist, I've met thousands of them. And they have absolutely nothing to do with factory farms. Those are two different systems, two different moral systems. It is not the same. One is about feeding people. One is about making as gigantic amount of profit as you can with as little consideration for the animals as you can manage. And as one French farmer said to me in a horrible pig farming unit in Brittany, that if the European Union ever introduced rules which made his farm less like a car factory, he'd get out of the business. That's, it's naive I mean, big business will make money in whatever way it can. It's animals, it's soya, it's highly processed vegan food, it's highly processed not vegan food. And the idea that health, that if we cut out meat, we would have a healthy diet and the NHS would save money, is ludicrous. We are unhealthy because 55% of the diet in this country is ultra-processed food, and because we have a highly unequal society, which means that people cannot afford the right food. That's my last word.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much to Sheila and Simon and Alice. No more, sorry, we have no time.
I want to make a plug.
You want to make a plug? You can in a sec. Right, so I think Sheila has summed it up pretty well, actually. There's a huge amount of similarities, complementarity, and belief systems and philosophy and everything else between the vegan world and, shall we say, the sport, which to a certain extent this fair represents. A hell of a lot more that joins us than separates us, and separates us from the industrial food complex, which is really the bane of so much of all of this, the problems that we have. So, Simon is going to make a plug. And apart from that, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the fair. Thank you for spending time with us here. And thank you to our speakers.
Just to say that the Land magazine has a stall in the side tent over there. And if you're interested in these issues in any further depth, then issue number 24 is almost entirely on this subject, and you can buy it there. Also, the next issue of the Land magazine will have a critique of George Monbiot's Regenesis in it, which includes a large number of the figures that my colleague here quoted.